Thank you for joining us on this very snowy evening. I am Marianne Murphy-Zarzana, SMSU Director of Creative Writing and Assistant Professor of English. I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Thomas Maltman tonight. I met Tom when we were in graduate school together, working on our Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at Minnesota State University at Mankato. His essays, poetry, and fiction have been published in many literary journals. His first novel, The Nightbirds, won an Alex Award, a Spur Award, and the Friends of American Writers Literary Award. In 2009, the American Library Association chose The Nightbirds as an outstanding book for the college-bound. He's taught for 4 years at Normandale Community College and lives in the Twin Cities. Little Wolves is his second novel, which just came out this year, and it's already receiving excellent reviews. You may purchase both of these books in the lobby afterwards. Yesterday, Tom gave the keynote address at the Regional Creative Writing Contest, co-sponsored by the SMSU English Department and the Southwest West Central Service Cooperative. He inspired the young writers in 3rd through 12th grade with his passion for writing. Today, he joined my writer's workshop to critique student works in progress, and we appreciated his insightful comments and feedback. He's currently at work on his 3rd novel, and we look forward to many more novels by Tom. Please join me in a warm welcome for Thomas Maltman.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Marianne. It's great to be back here with Marianne and to be here at SMSU. I've really enjoyed my time with the students, and it's been a great couple of days despite the snow. Even despite the snow, we've had fun. So I'm going to read to you from a couple of different chapters from my second novel, Little Wolves. And before I go into this chapter here, I should talk to you a little bit about how the novel came about. I wanted to do something a little different. My first novel was historical fiction, set in 1862, required heavy in-depth research, and I love the research, but I wanted to do a novel that was more contemporary. And at the time when I was thinking about the novel, I had gone duck hunting with a local rancher who was kind enough to show me the valley of the area where we were living. And as we were driving through in his truck, I noticed a coyote coming up from the tall grass. And so I just pointed it out and said, "Hey, look, there's a coyote over there." And he slammed on the brakes of his truck, brought us to a grinding halt, and rapped on the back of his window. And his son was standing in the back of the truck there, and his son rose up, jacked a shell into the shotgun, and blasted the coyote. And so as the coyote was dying, we went out and stood over it in the grass, and he told me about how they'd recently come back to the valley after a long absence. But I was kind of troubled by the death of the coyote, because I realized if I kept my mouth shut, if I hadn't said anything, that coyote would have escaped. It would have gone on living. And I remember talking to my father-in-law, who is himself a farmer, and telling him about my guilt that I felt about this coyote's death, and he just looked at me and said, "Welcome to the country." And so that's the chapter title that I'm going to read to you is called "Welcome to the Country," and so it is, it's a different way of life. But what I often feel like as a novelist, I know I'm onto something when two things come together. So just like two rocks come together, make sparks. At the time when I was writing this, we were also expecting the birth of my first daughter, Tess. And so I was reading in parenting manuals, and if you read parenting manuals, they often they make you feel guilty about all the things you're not going to be able to do, or they terrify you about all the things that might go wrong. So they're very useful. But one of the things that can possibly quote unquote go wrong is that a child can be born with a condition called lanugo, and that's where they emerge from the mother and they're coated in this thin gray fur. And so it eventually is absorbed back into the body, so it only lasts for a couple of weeks. But I just had this image of this wolf baby being born, and so here's the two things coming together. There's the story of this death and the story of this baby being born. And so there's where the sparks come from. And so that's really what got me started, is a story about birth and a story about death. And so in the very beginning, I have this young couple They're strangers in this town, and they're strangers to each other. There's been a terrible murder that has just taken place. Her husband is a pastor. He feels like he doesn't have the answers that the community requires to help them heal. She's struggling with issues of her own because this person who's done this act of violence was one of her own students, and so is also trying to deal with this. And so I'm going to read you from a scene early on in the novel, and this is what happens when she comes down for breakfast one morning. So welcome to the country is this chapter title. Logan had already been up for an hour by the time Clara came downstairs. He sat alone at the dining room table, leaning on his elbows, his blonde hair dark with sweat. He was wearing a t-shirt, skimpy lycra shorts, and tube socks pulled up nearly to his knees. Logan didn't turn his head to wish her good morning when she entered the room, but he kept his attention fixed on the rain outside, muttering something, a prayer, under his breath. She had come downstairs wearing only a blue terry cloth robe. She wanted to get a cup of coffee and then head upstairs to soak in a bath and write some more, but spotting Logan changed her plans. "I'm going to fry some eggs," she told him. "Want any?" Logan startled at the sound of her voice. Then he shook his head without turning her way. "I can't eat so early in the morning, especially not after a run." Clara crossed the room and touched his damp face with the back of her hand, feeling the braille of his boyish beard. "You need to eat something," she said. Above his hollow cheeks, his eyes sank into their sockets. Day by day, Clara was growing rounder, while her husband shrank, as if she were one of those spiders who feeds on her mate, drinking in his juices until he's only a sack to lay the eggs in. What a terrible thought. She was having such thoughts these days. Clara knew Logan was fasting in the morning again, heading straight over to church and starting his day by kneeling before the altar, his hunger a punishment for not having the answers his congregation required. Perhaps it was wrong of her to tempt him with fried eggs, but looking at him now, her pale, handsome husband with his knobby knees and receding hairline, a motherly tenderness welled in her. "What were you thinking about here, sitting in the dark?" "Satan," he said, glancing her way and smiling ruefully. "Oh, is that all?" She pulled over a chair so she could sit beside him. "Feels strange to say aloud, sort of foolish." Was it? She knew Logan loved the story of Martin Luther battling the devil in his last days, flinging a book across the room and reminding Lucifer of his baptism. What was God without the devil, heaven without hell? Though he considered himself a modern seminarian, quick to point out that accounts of demon possession in the Gospels were likely manifestations of mental illness, Clara knew that he also believed in the devil. That the devil was active in this world made Logan's work more urgent. Clara put her hand over his. "Tell me what you saw." "I don't know exactly," he said, squirming in his chair, edging deeper into the cushioned seat. "Except that I was up in the pulpit looking out over my parishioners when I spotted him. He was an ordinary-looking guy, just a guy in a dark suit, but with his eyes he took away my voice. I tried to speak, but it was like there were hands." Logan paused and massaged his throat with his free hand, choking the words. The congregation knew something was wrong, but I was alone up there. No one even noticed him there except for me, the devil there, smiling. How awful. His hand beneath hers was cold, as if the rain had soaked straight through him on his morning jog. She wondered if Logan's telling of the dream was also meant to rebuke her for not being in church last Sunday. She knew exactly the rational reason behind what he'd seen, and that it was called the hag's dream, or sleep paralysis. While you sleep, your body locks down your muscles to keep you from acting out your dreams. But sometimes you wake up partially. You rise to a conscious state and realize your body is paralyzed, and in that moment you panic and see the thing you most fear. In the Middle Ages, it was a mare, a black horse, which is how the word nightmare comes down to us through the ages. Clara knew what Logan's dream was because she knew her etymology, like any good linguist. But she said nothing to her husband because it wouldn't help him feel any better. She had also had trouble sleeping, her dreams restless and furtive, as if she had tuned in to the voices scattered about town, where the story of what had happened went on and on, a psychic echo. Writing in her notebook, telling her father's stories, soothed the voices and let her rest. Writing was her prayer. The only language she spoke for a time was her hand on his. Nightmares aside, it felt good to be with him in the gloomy morning, touching. The next words slipped out of her without thinking. Was it a mistake to come here? When Logan flinched, she wished she could take it back. Logan withdrew his hand. Doesn't do any good to think about that. We're here. The room next to them was still cluttered with unpacked boxes a couple of months after their arrival. "We could go," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could tell the Senate bishop it wasn't a good fit. Ask for a reassignment." A faint flush crept into Logan's cheeks as he studied her. 3 years, Clara. If you spend less than that in your first call, it looks bad on your record. We waited 2 months for this assignment. How would I get another call? There was nothing kind in his blue eyes, so she looked away from him. "We can't leave them in a lurch. Not after this," Logan continued when she didn't say anything. "Besides, coming here was your idea, remember?" "People make mistakes all the time. There's no shame in admitting it." Logan rose from his chair, closing off the conversation. He was moving away from her once more, going off to shower and then to the church next door. "I found a home for those kittens," he said, surprising her. "Last Sunday, after the service." "What?" "I think that's part of what's bothering me. My allergies. Just having them in the basement. The Nelson family said they would take them. All their cats died from the distemper. Now they have rats in the barn again." Clara couldn't bear to look at him. "I want to come with when you take them." "No. The Nelsons are very private people." Logan averted his gaze. Had she caught him in a lie? Was he planning on dumping those kittens by the side of the road, or worse? It occurred to her that she didn't know what he was capable of doing. If Clara saw the Nelsons in church, she would ask them about the kittens, but she had no idea whom he was talking about. Most of Logan's congregation were still strangers to her. "They'll all die. They're too small. They were born too late in the fall." "Welcome to the country," Logan said. "I didn't know when I married you that you had a mean streak." Logan touched her hair, patting it. This should have bothered her even more, but his touch took away the other words she was going to say, and she let his fingers linger there. It surprised her how much she wanted him to touch her when she had just been ready to spit in his eye. She shut her eyes while he massaged her scalp. "You feel things too keenly," he said. His voice was lower, calming. His fingers found the ridges in her skull, pressed gently at the tension. "I'm not trying to be mean. You knew from the night you found them you couldn't keep them. Just let me keep them one more day." Logan kissed the top of her head. "A few more days. I'll take them on Friday. The Nelsons are good people, Clara." By good people, it was clear what he meant. His kind of people, church people. She let the comment pass because she could feel the baby stirring inside her. She let it pass because her husband, who had been avoiding her, was touching her, his hands moving from her hair to her shoulders. "The baby," she told him. "It's kicking. Do you want to feel it?" Logan's hands went still. She opened her robe. Her breasts were heavy and full. Beneath them, the globe of her belly stretched, blue veins winding over the surface. Something, a hand or foot, thrust outward from the skin. "Clara," he said, "the curtains are open." The world outside, gauzy with rain. "I don't care." She guided Logan's hand to her stomach, closing her own over the top. They didn't have to wait more than a minute. Feeling Logan's cold hand, the baby thumped once more, then sank back into the depths within her. "Weird, huh?" she said to feel the silence. Clara knew he was studying the curve of her breast. She had seen the longing and loneliness in him from the very first time she met him. Now she wanted him to stay. She wanted him to keep touching her. And shouldn't he want her even more, since she almost died? Shouldn't he affirm this life, hers, the mystery inside her? They hadn't made love since finding out about the baby. Clara's conversion to Lutheranism was inextricably bound up in the physicality of her husband. Logan had been her father's pastor. A few weeks after her father died, Clara attended services at Logan's church one gray Sunday and was surprised when Logan asked her to brunch at the cafe down the street. They would meet again for coffee in a few days, then dinner out, followed by dinner at his place. He needed her, she saw, just as much as she needed him. In his quietness, she read depth. In his shy touch, innocence. The first time she undressed for him, undid the buttons on her blouse, she had watched the pupils in his light blue eyes darken with desire. "I knew I would love you before I ever met you," he told her later in the bedroom that night. "It was the sound of your name in the stories your father told about you. Clara, clear as running water. Clara, like clarity, clean like the sky. I knew you before I ever saw you." Behind them, the phone jostled on the receiver. Logan's hand was still on her stomach, tracing slow circles, her hand on his. "Don't. Stay." Logan went to get the phone. So that's an early chapter in the novel, and as you can see, they're still reeling, and it's impacted them on a relational level as well. I'm going to read a scene from later in the novel, too. So the story is braided between two voices. And even with this young couple out on the prairie, I knew that I wanted another story. And one morning I woke up and I heard, I just felt in a dream the voice of this father. His son has just done something terrible, and he's struggling for answers why. He doesn't know why his son has done this thing. And I sat and I wrote, and I showed my wife the pages, and she said, this is the story that you have to tell. And so it really transformed what was a very simple story, the story of this young couple, the simple small town story, into a murder story. And as Cindy and I were talking for the interview, not so much a whodunit, but a whydunit. And I really wanted to get to know the character of this young man who has done this terrible thing. And so this is a flashback scene where the father is remembering a moment between he and his boy. I had a professor when I was an undergraduate who told me that all stories on some level are about sex and death. And I don't quite believe him that I would be quite so reductive in describing what literature is about. But I think that that's probably a fair approximation of what many stories are about. So this is the death part right here. But don't worry, it's not too gruesome. So this is the chapter called Little Wolves, the scene between one of my other main characters, Grizz, and his son, Seth. Seth cried out, "Dad, look, a coyote." His son had rapped on the passenger side window and pointed. It was a late afternoon in March when the sun's rays warmed the frozen earth just enough that a silvery mist spiraled from the marshes. Grizz had followed his hand, and there it was. At first he thought it was a small dog, but then he noticed the lean snout and long fox-like ears. Grizz slammed on the brakes, jerking Seth forward in his seat so hard he nearly hit the windshield before his belt snapped him back. The truck slid along the gravel road before grinding to a halt. A second later, he was out the door, plucking up a .22 rifle he kept behind the seat. Dust from the road rained down around him. The coyote heard all this and yawned, displaying rows of little razor teeth. It looked indolent and dreamy with the mist rising all about it. He took his time, balancing the rifle on the truck bed. If the coyote had not cast one backward glance as it trotted away, it might have escaped into the tall grass. But the rifle made a small barking cough, and the animal went down. He reloaded while the boy stepped out of the passenger side and followed him into the meadow. The coyote was a handsome creature, with shimmering bronze fur and round dark eyes, and breathed as though in its mind it was still running. It lay on its side in the tall grass, and the air around them smelled of musk and blood in its terror. The coyote's breathing shallowed. "Aren't you going to finish it off?" Seth asked. He held himself and shivered as though it was a strangely warm spring day. "It'll be dead soon enough." "Why'd you have to shoot it? I was only showing you where it was." "Because," he said. At first the words didn't come right. "Why?" "Because that was the way of things. No farmer going back to the beginning of time could allow such animals to threaten his living. So he told Seth about summer nights when the ranch house windows were open to allow in a breeze, how his mother couldn't sleep for the sound they made. It stirred her up, that eerie howling. He told him about the calves being born in spring and how the coyotes were always there in the morning, licking the birthing fluids from the blood-streaked ground, ghost shapes that were gone again before he could raise a gun. While he told him, he could see it in his mind's eye, a primal scene, cattle tonguing the afterbirth from their calves, while coyotes slumped nearby, waiting to drink the rich placental blood from the grass. "Parasites," he said, "little ravenous wolves. At least now there's one less of them." Seth's face had gone pale. His features weren't set yet, the bones shifting in his face as if what he would become was still being written. Seth knelt in the grass next to the coyote. It was a female, the heavy dugs showing on her stomach. "Why do you think she didn't run?" he said. And when Grizz had no answer, he asked her softly, "Why didn't you run?" He reached out one hand to stroke her fur. "Don't touch it," Grizz warned. But she was too wounded to do more than growl with what minutes remained in her, her black gums peeling back to reveal long incisors, pink with froth. One filmy eye fixed him, and then she went still. Grizz put his hand on Seth's shoulder and started to say something when a noise caught his attention, a sound on the hill above where there should have been only silence. Seth jumped up and went ahead of him. She had died not far from a granite boulder, ringed by a thicket of sumac. Seth pushed through the branches and reached in. From the dark hole where the coyote had made her den, Mewling cries echoed. Her kit, probably born just a few weeks before. "Stop," he commanded Seth. "Don't you go any nearer." Seth's back went rigid, but he didn't turn around at the sound of his voice. He'd go on back down to the truck and wait for me there. He gave just the faintest shake of his head. "You don't want to see this kind of work, but it has to be done. It's the only thing we can do." When Seth did turn around, his eyes were hard and glittery. "No," he said, "I won't let you." He clenched his fist, the wind rustling his baggy jacket. In the distance, a red-winged blackbird sang out in warning, hearing them on the hill above. From his vantage point, Grizz could see the farm and the stretch of black fields. They would need to take out the spreader now that the manure was no longer frozen, clean out a winter's worth of mess from the barns, and fertilize the fields. A long day's work, but the boy would get to pilot the bobcat in and out of the barn, and he loved driving it. Grizz was anxious to get down and get started. "If I don't do this, Seth, they're going to starve a long, slow death." Such a stubborn child. When they kept pigs, Seth hated when the runts were born. They had to kill them right off so they didn't keep the sow's milk from those capable of surviving. They stretched them on a board and cracked their little skulls with a ball-peen hammer. When Seth was little, it used to make him cry. He would steal those runts and take them up into the loft and hide them in a hole he'd hollowed out in the hay. Then he would take out a turkey baster and fill it with milk from the kitchen and carry it out to the barn. Grizz knew what he was doing the whole time and didn't stop him. The runts all died, despite his best efforts. He left the boy alone to learn that some things aren't meant for this world. By the time he was 10, Seth was hardened, and when he started growing prize-winning sows for the FFA, he learned to wield the ball-peen hammer himself. And Grizz thought the whole time he had been teaching him about mercy. "No, not if we take them home." Grizz lay his gun down in the grass. "These aren't like puppies from a dog, Seth. They're wild things, and they belong out here in the wild. We start violating the natural order and bad things will happen." He squared his shoulders and leveled his gaze. "Now get back down to the truck. Let me do what I have to do." "No." Seth's jaw jutted out, and he drew himself up, and Grizz saw how big he was becoming. Still, he could shove him aside, and it would be all over in a few seconds. His iron-toed boots would crush a few baby coyote skulls, and then it would be done. "What do you think people in town will say when they hear we're raising coyotes?" "I don't care. I'll only keep them until they get big enough to live on their own. One thing that keeps us safe from such creatures is that they fear us. You take away that fear, and you're going to hurt both them and us." Behind them, the whimpering of the pups continued. The boy's eyes watered, but he kept his footing. And when Grizz laid a hand on his shoulder, he flinched. That one action, a simple flinch, took away his breath. His son thought he was going to hit him. He never hit Seth, hadn't whipped him in years. "Okay," he said. "Okay. We can take them home, but they have to sleep in the old brood house. We can't have them in the barn or anywhere near the cows. You're going to have to make sure they're cleaned every day." "We'll get one of those heating lamps," Seth said. "I'll stretch a cord from the barn, and we can keep them in a box with some blankets, and we can feed them with the calving bottles. Not a word in school, understand? I don't want people in town hearing what we've done." Seth drew his hand across his mouth, zipping it shut. One by one, the 3 pups were lifted, blind and trembling from the den, and deposited in the warmth of Seth's coat. They rode home together, with that pungent scent filling up the cab, and the sound of them crying so loud, Grizz could hardly hear himself think. The boy talked to them in a cooing voice, wincing when a claw hooked his chest under the shirt. "Little wolves, is that what you called them, Dad?" "It's what some call coyotes, sure. My little wolves," he said. "I'm going to take care of you." All through the spring and summer, Seth fed them faithfully with the bottle they used for the calves and formula from Juergen's Corner, replacing the nipples that the coyotes gnawed to rubbery shreds. When they were big enough to eat from his hand, he let them go, true to his word. They'd come back every night since. The boy was not surprised, not supposed to feed them anymore, but Grizz knew that he took them scraps and dry dog food, and that was how they came to be so large, the size of wolves instead of bony coyotes. So that's a flashback scene when Grizz is remembering his son. After his son dies early in the book, his son has murdered the town sheriff and killed himself then in a field of corn. So after his son has done this thing, his father, of course, is searching for answers. But after he's done this thing too, the coyotes, they still come back. The boy had held them at bay basically, and they invade the town, and and the town's not sure what to do with these animals that come by night, and they're afraid of them. And so it's partly the story that the pastor's wife knows in some ways that these animals are still searching for this boy. And so that's a third braid that works in there. I'm fascinated by stories of feral children, children who have been raised by animals. And so there's this fairy tale of this child who during a time of war is rescued by this wolf mother and raised out on the prairie. And so that's a third story that gets braided in with Clara's story and with Logan's story too. And they all come together in some ways. That's what I like to do is when you have a braided story, to see the different ways that they might connect, hopefully in ways that are surprising and for your reader. But those are my two main characters and two early scenes from the novel. And I think at this point, we'd like to open it up to questions. And so you've heard these scenes here, and I'm curious if there's any questions that you all have out there in the audience. So quiet now. Who's going to break the ice with the first question? Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
We were talking a little bit today about writing and revising, and Mary Ann in the introduction said you're working on a third book. Do you have like a fourth or fifth sitting out there? Are you somebody that has, multiple things going at one time, or?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the last stuff on about the French prince who escaped to live among the Indians, and I do want to start a novel too about the Vikings coming to Minnesota and discovering Minnesota and that rune stone that's up in Alexandria, and just kind of a fun novel that would dance back and forth between a scholar who's looking at the stone, believing it real, and the Vikings themselves actually in Minnesota. So that's my fourth planned work, and there's other stories that I feel a longing to tell. I would say that my one trait as a writer is simple, dogged persistence. I will stick with something to the very bitter end. And there's a lot of writers who they'll write, and they'll set things aside and go work on something else, And for me, the only thing that I found is once I latch onto a project, I just don't let go, and I just keep. And so that's hard because with a novel, especially for me, not having as much writing time as I would like, it means you're in it for a long haul. And so I'm tempted. I really love to go write some poems or do a short story because you can be done with a short story maybe in a few weeks, or if you're lucky, maybe a draft will blaze out in a week. But I get stuck, and that's the one thing that I do is I'm able to finish stuff because I latch on, I don't let go, and I hold on until I'm sure that it's done. So I do think it's healthier. I would advise the younger writers here, I think, work on something for a while, and when you hit a dead end, it's the smart thing is to set it aside and to work on something else. That's the smart thing. I don't do the smart thing, but I'm still able to finish stuff, but I'm stubborn, So that's all. Is I do have these other ideas out here, and I'm hoping that I get smarter about it, Jim. And so with this next project, when I write it, I've tried several things. This historical fiction. I started a tentative draft last summer. That's kind of a steampunk draft, have you guys, what steampunk is, with the balloons, and all kinds of stuff going on, and yeah, I love his stuff. Yeah, oh, yeah, so I had, like the gargoyles of Notre Dame, and they would come alive at night, and the gargoyles served the church, and or like the Brotherhood, they were called. And, so I had all these kind of different elements going. But, then there's part of me that's torn that's like, there's so much drama in the real history. Why do I need to add the steampunk elements? Because there's already a lot of drama in the actual history. So I get torn about different things. And so when I come back, I don't know if I'm going to do the straight historical or if I'll try, that steampunk element again and see where it carries me. So yeah, that's a good question though. Because I do think it's good to have a couple of different things going on at a time. Other questions too? Either about the story, about writing. Yes.
Who are your favorite novelists to read?
Yeah. So we were talking about Cormac McCarthy earlier today, and I think he has absolutely hypnotic prose. His prose just it will cast a spell over you. I think that some of his stuff is really twisted. I'm trying to think of his first one of his early novels that's just set during the time of the Comanches and the Civil War. It's incredibly violent, disturbing, but it's so lyrically written that it may be one of the most beautiful novels I've ever read. But I really like his other stuff like The Road and even All the Pretty Horses, where he's able to take his linguistic elements and marry it to a story that has a strong emotional resonance. So I like him. I like Marilyn Robinson, who wrote Housekeeping and Gilead. She's able to weave themes of faith into her stories, but in a way that's totally non-didactic, and is approachable to people no matter what people believe. So I like writers like that, and then I'll read everything that I can get my hands on, popular authors, and I love Steinbeck and classic authors like that too. Out here on the prairie, I think everyone living in Marshall, Minnesota, you should read all, Giants in the Earth by Rovag, to know what the grasslands were like back in the day. There's so many. I wish that there were more hours in the day for all the things that I would love to read. So one of the authors that I've been really into lately is Dan Keown. Has anyone read Dan Keown at all? What I love is he brings like comic book style elements into his writing, and he has a great short story called Big Me, where this boy believes he's a detective, and so he invents all these crazy stories. He believes the 7th grade teacher is really him in the future, and he's come back and brought a warning to him. And it's this really well done and actually kind of creepy story, but it's fantastic. And so he uses a lot of comic book elements. And I like authors who take risk like that too. So people like Dan Keown, I also really enjoy. But I will read everything I can get my hands on. I'm greedy for books, for sure. So, good question too. Other questions as well. Take this lid off. Go ahead, Miriam.
You talked a little bit at lunchtime when we met about all the distractions that we all have, especially this generation. And you talked a little bit about how you handle that. Could you talk?
Sure. For me, doing it in the first thing in the morning is when my mind's fresh. I have one of those brains that just kind of accumulates junk as the day goes on, and it gets less and less efficient the longer the day goes. And so I've got to do it in the morning when I'm fresh, and before I check email or anything, to start writing right away. And sometimes I'll write longhand before I get on the computer, and that just allows me to focus and get the story down. So I find that that's one of the ways that I minimize distraction. I think that you've got to have a way of carving out a set time. And because some writers, you might prefer writing in the evening. You might find that you're more of a night writer. And if that's the case, then you have these hours, whatever it is, after the kids have gone to bed or whatever, that you're going to set aside and you're going to write. And Ron Carlson says that the writer is the person who stays in the room. And I really think that that's true. With my students, we show a scene from Adaptation with Nicolas Cage, and there's this great moment when he sits down to write. And, he's very serious in the story, where to begin the story. And so, he freezes over the keyboard there, and before he can even put down a word, he's like, I could really use a muffin. A blueberry muffin would be so great right now. And then, it comes back to the story, where to begin. And so, he starts thinking about all these different distractions. And so there's a number of different things. With my students, we'll actually practice just briefly in class, breathing exercises, like where you just shut your eyes and you count to 10, and every time a distracting thought rises up, you start over again. So it's a real minimalist form of meditation, but it allows you to center, and it doesn't take very long, but it makes you so you're more centered and focused. And Ron Carlson says the writer's the person that stays in the room. I think it's good to add, what studies show is that after about 45 minutes to an hour, it's good to actually get up and walk around for a little bit, or do some kind of brainless task like wash the dishes. Because as you're washing the dishes, even if you're not trying to think about your story or your poem or your essay or whatever it is you're working on, things are going to start to occur to you as you're doing this task. So you do these kind of mindless tasks like that, and then you come back and you write again. And so working in like these hour cycles, I think is another way to minimize and to focus in a world that is terribly unfocused. So I've learned to try different tricks like that allow me to get the writing done. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any subjects that you consider off limits?
No. So, and I think that I love, there's Russell Banks has this saying, don't look away from the difficult moment. Because the truth is, a lot of times when we get to that difficult moment, it's something hard. We want to look away. We don't want to write it. And even these characters that in this last novel here, they're dealing with some heavy stuff. And so to go and sit down and be in these characters' minds day after day, it's not an easy thing. But so I think that idea that the writer's the one who doesn't look away from the difficult moment. Stephen King says, tell whatever story you want to tell, but tell the truth, And that's another way of approaching it, too, is that as a writer, it doesn't matter what kind of fantastic elements you're dealing with. We tell the truth about who human beings are. And so if we're going to capture the human condition, then we've got to be able to be willing to go into territories that that might be troubling, that might be disturbing, and so I would say that there's certain things like I read. We mentioned authors that we like. I read George R. Martin, the Game of Thrones series. So we were talking about him earlier, and we're really great at pacing. But the dude is obsessed with incest. I'm sorry. There's like, how many different incest? Every single royal family in there, they've got some kind of incest theme going on. I'm just like, come on. All right, we get it, So I just, that's one of the big weaknesses of that series in my mind is it's just too much, But so there are some themes that I don't want to write about that I definitely I would go out of my way not to write about, but there's definitely, I would say, there's no off-limits subject, none that I would, I want to write books that struggle with hard issues, that ask, why, how do we make meaning of our suffering? What does evil mean? Why do people do evil? And that deal with those issues frankly. So, so for me, I would say no off-limits subjects. I want to find, I want to tell the truth as much as I can. So, but great question though. Are there off-limits subjects for you?
Well, I would say that when it's starting to deal with people I know,
Yeah.
and I feel it's an invasion of privacy,
Mhm.
that's when I have to look really hard
Mhm.
at whether it is worth it to invade somebody's privacy in order to say what it is I have to say.
And that really depends on, I think, the situation, the story that you're trying to tell, like for a memoir, for instance. If you're writing a memoir about your family, wow, that's hard to tell that kind of story. I think with fiction, you're allowed a certain amount of latitude. People understand that it may have its basis in a true story, but they know it's a work of the imagination. And so even if it has its basis in something true, I think that you're allowed some freedom. And so you can write about a guy and put a mustache on him, and if he complains, say, no, that wasn't you. He has a mustache. You don't have a mustache. So not that I would do that. I wouldn't. But I do think that there, I don't know. We were talking about the Tobias Wolff quote earlier, that as soon as a writer is born into a family, that family is ruined. And I wouldn't go that far. Like my parents, because they might write about the family life or whatever. I can remember when I first started writing poetry, my mother would say, "Watch out what you say around him. We might end up in one of his poems." So and Anne Lamott says, she's like, don't be sorry about writing about people in your life. She's like, if they're upset about it, then they should have been nicer to you, is what Anne Lamott says. And I wouldn't go that far either. And I would say I would never want somebody to be hurt by a story that I told, whether it's someone I love or even somebody who I don't love. But I hopefully don't tell the kind of stories that would hurt people, while they deal with hard issues. I hope that in the end that they're still hopeful stories. So yeah. Was there something specific you were thinking about, with the, not hurting people or?
Well, I just wrote a poem today about it, so.
Still fresh on your mind. Yeah. And poets, again, it's you're closer to the truth. You don't get quite as much latitude as maybe the fiction writers do. So, well, maybe one last question, if there's any other questions out there. And if there's not any other questions, Marianne, yes.
You've got two daughters, two young daughters,
Yes.
2 and 5.
Yes.
Who write story. Think of writers who have written stories for their children or whatever.
Sure.
Do you have any?
Yeah, so one of the main characters in this novel, Clara, she's come back to this town. She suspects it's where her mother was from, and she's never knew her mother. Her mother died shortly after giving birth to her in a car accident, so she's come back to this town. Her father refuses to speak about the mother, and the only stories that he will tell her about her identity are these stories that this wolf, this child rescued by this wolf, and this child on the prairie. And so that's all that she has to go on. So the very first one is it's almost like a children's story. And so I read it to my daughter at night. I said I finished the pages, and it was really kind of fun when she was this was a few years ago when I first started the novel, and could sit down and read her and see whether or not to watch on this 5-year-old's face if she was hooked, and she wanted to know what happened next. What happened to the baby and the wolf, and would ask me about it. Then I knew that again, I was onto something. So I do, and I like watching them tell stories, watching them write. One of the things that she did a few summers ago is they would go out into the backyard and they would act out these stories. The Kids and the Witch was one of the stories that she would act out. And she would, the stories always killed off the parents. I tried not to get offended that she would kill me off right away in their stories. But she and her sister would be these orphans in these stories. But I love that she would act them out before she would write them down. And because I do think that that's a good thing for you to do as a writer is, really kind of act out your stories sometimes will help you realize things about them. So I have written some things that I read to them. But she came down and I saw her the other day. She was 8 years old now, and she was reading some of this novel, and I was like, "Oh, it's not really for you." I didn't want to say anything. I was like, "Oh, you need to wait till you're a few years older before you tackle that one." So I didn't say anything, and eventually she, set it aside. Maybe realizing that it was, she's not quite old enough for on her own without me having to say anything. But yeah, there are some parts that I've shared with her. So. Thank you for coming through the snow and through the hard weather, and to listen tonight. And it's great to see all of you here. And thank you to Marianne and to Jim and to the entire English department, creative writing department here at Southwest State. You guys are awesome, and it's been fun to be here.